All right. So, we are onboarding new engineers at Artsy, and that generally means trying to introduce them to new code bases. So, rather than try and make these things where we sit down and go over the code base one on one, it's generally pretty awesome that because we have an open source project that we should try and share these uh, movies with everyone else. So I'm going to do a code review of our oldest project. And that's called Folio or Energy, depending on whether it's developers or the public talking about it. You can see it here on the left. That's not too different from what it looks like when it's the open source version. The only minor change is that I have the ability to look at documents and sync if I wanted to. I'm not going to go into sync. That's an entirely separate video. So I want to get started with a little bit of history of what this is. Folio is a tool for galleries to basically email out the artworks that they put on Artsy when they're at fairs or out and about. It's on both the iPhone and on the iPad. What I'm going to show you is basically a story of how a gallery would use it most of the time, and then we're going to try and go through the general code path that the application would use to do this. Then we're going to try and go over the testing systems that we have in place for a bunch of these things in order to understand how do we ensure that future versions don't break. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to show you the first things that happens. So Folio exists in this really interesting context where it was built before Artsy.net and Artsy iOS even were public and available for anyone to use it. So Folio was this idea that we could persuade galleries that there is value in putting data inside Artsy, which was not public yet, first of all, so that we could do artwork genoming, sort of connecting everything together. But the other part is that we could give them back this tool called Artsy Folio, where they would have this portfolio of all the works that they had uploaded to the website, available on iPad at the time, that they could then use to show off to clients and use at fairs, because at the time, and to some extent still are, a lot of galleries still print out these big books of all of the shows that they have, and then take those with them to an art fair. An art fair is basically like a conference, but for art galleries. So what they generally do is they would open this portfolio, this folio app. They know exactly what artworks they're going to because they're probably discussing it, and they want to email that to somebody else. So in this case, let's say you wanted to take an artwork for Fence the dog and send it to someone that you're talking to in front of you right now. So you would click on the artist Fence the dog, and you would be taken into a view controller that has works, shows, and documents. Each of those is just a grid of different items, and it pretty quickly makes it very easy to hit the email button, tap a few artworks, and then hit compose. And that will bring up this kind of artwork metadata view controller popover that allows you to state things like, what sort of information do I want to include in this email? Do I want to include something like the inventory ID, which is a very internal data that most people aren't that interested in including. Also, pricing is complicated because galleries and partners don't necessarily want to show the full price every time. So they would have something like a public price range on the front end of Artsy.net and on Artsy iOS, whereas for themselves internally they'll have an actual number. So in these cases I have public prices, which are price ranges, but I also have a backend price, which is very specific price that could say it has to go over this amount. We also have attached documents to artists and shows. So in this case, we have Fence the Dog's docs, which is P33019 blah blah blah. Not very awesome. And there's also, because some of these works are inside the show, then we also have documents from that show. So typically you may have an overview of the current show in a PDF form, talking about the artist's bio and the motivations behind the choices that were made in order to present these artworks. So you can then attach all these together, hit email, it will generate this HTML file that is then sent out to people very quickly. And ta-da, that's basically the entire flow of like the vast majority of the application's use cases. One of the other ways in which people try to use Folio is to create collections on the device. So the flow for that is generally, we call them new albums. So you go into the album, you click edit, you create a new album. We'll call this demo free. Yep, this is the third time I've started this, but hey. So I'm going to create one that's just a few works on Order the Rocks and a few works on Point to Float Star. In case you're wondering, these are all pictures I've taken. And now suddenly we've got a demo free album, and it's all those works. And it makes it very easy to have a collection of artworks that you can easily compose and send out. Nothing too out of the blue. So while that happens, I'm going to open up the iPhone version to just generally show you the differences between the two, because this comes up a bit in the code. Because it turns out, like, taking something that's built for an iPad down to an iPhone is a non-trivial decision. So while that's happening, generally what we tried to do was to have the same code path for both. So we kind of have these adaptive buttons that could either be where before you may have saw edit on the top, now these sort of things would appear down along the bottom. So it's like easier for your thumb. You'll note that like very few of this is like pure UI kit. This is because to some extent this design hasn't changed in 4 years. The things that we built here like still look the exact same as when we first shipped Folio, which is great because iOS 7 then came and it looks like this, and we didn't have to make that much changes. So you see, like down here we've got an edit button that now appears on the bottom. Because it's on the iPhone, we have to do different we have a set of different documents. So this is demo 1, create that. It's got some fence the dog. See how like these sort of things appear in different places here and there. If I go back, and then I could do it at some point the foot stars. There we go, great. We got a new album, demo 1. Here's all your things. Again, we can now get into a selection mode where instead it's like a full screen selection mode instead of like a toolbar on the top and like a cancel in the top and left, top right and left. And we can hit compose. We get the same popover. Ta-da! You hit email and it creates an email template. Nothing crazy. Okay. Whew. Right. So let's take a look at what's actually happening behind the scenes here. I think the safest place to start off with all this kind of stuff is generally the app delegate. So here's the app delegate. We did a bunch of work on the app delegate to bring it down to a reasonable size of code, which is under 300 lines of code. Lots of small methods throughout the app, except for this one, which unsurprisingly did finish launching with options. We had we use a separation that's in all of our code bases of like will finish launching options generally sets up things that have to be like that have to exist within an application, whereas in this case that's like things like setting up standard defaults, logging, like the router, so that's like all networking, making sure that there is a access tokens and stuff like that, analytics, and there's a really nice little try catch here that checks to see if the core data stuff matches what we have in the current context. So basically, if you're in a beta and we haven't bothered making a migration for a specific beta version, then it will just wipe the entire thing and let them know that it's done that. But I'm glad we do that. And then we have the did finish launching, where we have like this bit where up at the front we create a bunch of objects. One of the ways that we managed to simplify a bunch of this code is that we separated out the view controller hierarchy structure into a separate object. So what we have here is we have a bunch of like preparation bits of code where we're checking all the different states, like parts of the app could be in, and then we have like a pretty long collection of ifs and elses that say like, well, if you've logged in and already synced, then maybe do this. But what about if you've logged in and you have an XOF token that is on like timed out? Then maybe we should grab a new one, but we should still let you in. And then sort of dealing with things like the partner's ID has changed, so we need to update the metadata, and then try and figure out like, have you done sync in a long time? Should we be giving you notifications about this? Are you locked out? So let's say you joined Artsy as a partner and then you stopped being a partner, and like we probably shouldn't be giving you access to Folio. And then things like, have you even uploaded any works? So you're in a zero state. So at this point, like the app delegate only cares about like looking at the logic there. It cares about the logic, but it doesn't care about how it is presented. Like we have the initial view controller setup coordinator, which is one hell of a word, and it's that job of this initial view controller to actually set up the view controller hierarchy that you would see when you like open reveal, right? So it's got all this structure is generated entirely by a different object from the AR app delegate, which is kind of cool because it's really, really hard to test an app delegate. Whereas a separate object like the initial view controller setup coordinator is a lot easier to test because you can pass it a window and you can pass it a sync, which is like an object that represents the concept of syncing within Folio. It's like a pure data object, and we can write specs that are specific to each one of these methods, whereas the actual logic can sit inside the app delegate. And that's a really nice abstraction that we have in there. So let's move on. What do we get? So what happens then is the initial view controller setup will create a folio grid, where what it's going to do is it's going to make a top view controller, and it's going to DI in all of the information that the coordinator thing has. So it's going to pass in the thing that it already has. It's going to pass along a managed object context, which within the application is going to be a shared global, but within testing it will be a stubbed one all the time. And then sets itself up with a navigation controller and like the root view controller. And that's what ends up creating what you see here on the left. So we have that. Great. What does the top view controller look like then? So I'm going to switch back to 1. So our top view controller. The top view controller is it has a lot of responsibilities. As you can see, it's got four separate calls that it conforms to. It's got a bunch of properties that don't have comments on them, and this view controller is actually complicated quite considerably because of like it would be pretty simple if it was just this, right, where it's artists chosen albums, relatively, where it would just be like a tab view basically. But unfortunately, in order to pull off albums correctly, where suddenly you can have this edit mode where you're allowed to create or delete or rename albums, and like deal with all the modals and blah blah blah, then like the top view control actually gets quite complicated. So what's we got going on? A lot of this is stuff that you don't need to like care about too much. It also animates itself in on the first show, so it like fades in from the black. Very beautiful. And it's kind of the job of the top view controller to let the user also know whether it needs to sync. So there's this thing up here that because I've just downloaded it, doesn't tell me that I need to sync. But we have this kind of preferences, nothing too out of the blue. But if you need to sync, we show a notification there, and it's the role of the top view controller to do that. So what's inside. Oh yeah, it also hosts like search, but then so does every other view controller in here, so you can see it's consistent without that. And I'll make sure those in order to make sure those buttons don't disappear, you have to use the same reference. So we have to like pass around the search button in order to not make everything like animate in and out uglily. So what have we got? We've got the top view controller, which hosts has this title at the top, and that title has kind of tab view controller that we created that hosts grid view controllers. So those grid view controllers are called AR artwork. Well, artwork container is roughly what some of these are. So the artwork container is so these are all artwork containers. Wait, no, they're not artwork containers. They're shows. So these are just grid views. They're straight up grid views. So AR grid. Ooh, I started something. No. I've got to run it again. AR grid view controller. Right, here we go. So the grid view controller has tons of things going on because they do a lot. There's a bit of redundant stuff here. Like these are view controllers that have existed for 4 or 5 years. They've gone from being predating Arc and CocoaPods to like finally supporting UI collection view. And right, so their general job here is to be able to state like, are you in a selectable mode? Are you in editable mode? Its responsibilities are generally that it has been given a display mode, and these display modes are either all somethings or not all somethings. This is like one of those things that would be great for Swift enums. Because if it's an all something, then it doesn't need a fetch request, but if it is a non-all something, then it will need a fetch request. And that's just like a way of being able to state like, here's a fetch request for all of the albums that are used, that have the artist Fensterdog. So this is a grid of that, and then like this would be a grid of all shows, of shows that have Fensterdog as one of the artists inside it. The same for albums and the same for documents. They'll all be grids. So it has a bunch of responsibilities, especially around like selection. So it has to do all these animations, and like even just the little shrink back when it comes in. So like, you can see a pretty subtle in between that, and then it handles like selection on them and like keeping track of these compose and like whether you can like, select all or not select all. It's pretty simple stuff, but it's a lot of state. And that's okay. I'm alright with this. A lot of it tries to pass a lot of the work along to an AR grid view. And the AR grid view is a collection view that is given a context and will just fill the space. And the controller will deal with like when it should be reloading, how does the scroll work, like you can see the like bits squeeze up when they go away, and then they come back, so it handles that kind of stuff. It also handles selection, so like should it know when you tap on an artwork that whether it should select or whether it should go through. That's the job of this. It's relatively simple stuff. It gets pretty complicated around the fetch results stuff. This is all about like trying to deal with what happens when you change. The iPhone version doesn't support changing the order because we never found a good design for it and haven't come back to look at that yet. Whereas on the iPad it does. So when you're dealing with say, I think by default it orders by artist name and then title. But there are ways of like ordering it by medium, ordering it by date created, a bunch of other ways in which you can order these things. And all in all, they make it relatively simple by using like these generated fetch requests, which is next on my to-do to go through. So the class is generally actually quite simple to test because of some of these things. There's not a million of them, but there's a bunch. And because they're easy to set up, because they just have display modes, then we can easily like create one and then ask if we can select items in these cases, or we can start like stubbing out some of the requests that it makes to see whether it's actually doing what we expect when we're reloading. And generally, this stuff is pretty easy to test, which is kind of important because we want to make it sure that we don't break things. So it's this. Because we're on one artist, then we can only see sort by date, title, and medium, and that's just changing the fetch request. But if we were on, say, a show that had multiple artists and artworks, then suddenly this turns to a bit more metadata. So we could say, yeah, we want artist by medium. There we go. Nothing too crazy. Fab. Okay. So that's good. This is how the tests work. Pretty simple again. So the interesting thing here is that if I show you the settings, we generally have quite a few different like ways of which you can filter your current set of artworks when you're trying to present it. We call it presentation mode, which is like by default you have all the information, but then when you are with a client, you will probably want to hit presentation mode, and then it will say like only hide the prices, hide the price specifically sold works, and you can toggle all these off and on. You can have your own like quite complicated setup for this stuff. And of course, this is like 5 factorial right now, and like more can, may, will be added in the future. So one of the ways that we deal with like trying to deal with all of these settings is that we do them all inside like node fetch requests. We have this kind of NS fetch request plus AM models. And we use a collection of what do we call them? They're called compound predicates. So you can see here that it's like, so this is a compound predicates for a scoped artwork for an initial predicate. Oof, Objective-C. So it's saying like, here is the first predicate. So this is the one that scopes it. So like you have all artworks, so let's scope it down to all artworks by this artist. And then it starts to look through itself, through the defaults to see whether it like, should we be hiding publish, should we be hiding available for sale, and then some general filtering that's like, well, if there's images, we should show it, but maybe if some of them are processed, then we can do it anyway. And then we return these predicates that then get turned into fetch requests up here. So generally we can say like, okay, so we want to get all instances of artworks for a container class. All our instances of artworks for things that are inside a container class. Which is relatively simple because of this stuff. And one of the great things about this kind of consolidation here is that it makes it really easy to write tests for it. So we could do and it's could say a model test, and suddenly we've got like tons of them, double the amount of lines of code of the actual implementation. There's double that for tests, which all try to show different like aspects of these fetch requests because of the way which we structure our core data tests, which I'll go into later. Then this gets quite easy. And again, like that sort of stuff that we're looking for. Okay. So I have one more major section of like the app that I wanted to go over, and that's that emailing stuff. So this all exists inside a AR modern artwork email. No, artwork mail. No, mail artworks. Email artworks view controller. Naming. Okay, so we anytime we use like rewrite something, I call it a modern version of something, and then half the time I forget to unmodernize it at the end. So this has got a really like solid, beautiful public API. Like this was a relatively recent rewrite that came once I came across a talk from a guy called Justin Searles, who talked about the idea that every object should either be a data object or like a manipulation object. And once I heard that talk, I came to the conclusion that I finally understood how to deal with this complex problem of like, I want to have a view controller that will then eventually generate this HTML. And the old version of this was probably like 3 or 4 times the amount of code. So what's it now? 400 lines of code, which is I think it's pretty reasonable for its complexity. And what this does is you pass it all of the artworks in the documents, and you pass it a managed object context, and it will generate a table view, and do is it will create an output of an email settings. So this view controller will only exist to pass in artworks and documents, and it gives you back a model object called AR email settings that represents all of the settings for like the email. So this email setting says like, here's the artworks that are included, here's the documents that are included, here's the additional images that have been selected by the other bit, and here's the install shots that have been selected. And then there's some like metadata that's important to the emails, like should we show these bits, should we show this bit, should we show these price types, like the sort of things I showed you in the drop down. And then some more, some computed properties, because we have a pretty complicated email system. And so this system worked out really well. One of the great things about this idea of like having this view controller only generate a single object at the end and not do any other responsibilities around mailing is that it made it really, really easy to test. And like this is one of the most critical parts of the application, and getting something wrong here could be like accidentally emailing out a price that is something a gallery really doesn't want. And that's the sort of like, I'm never using this app again kind of problem that we never want to touch. So how do we do this? So this is modern emails artwork controller, modern emails artwork controller tests. I can make all these setups where I can say like, here's a document, here's an artist, here's an artwork, and a show, and we put them all together. I can then say, in the context of an iPhone 5, here is a bunch of snapshots. Oof, that's a lot of snapshots. We're doing a bunch of snapshots here. These are snapshot tests for the view controller, so we know that it looks what we expect. But all the other stuff here is like really easy to test, because it's John Reed talked about this a little bit, where he said that like expectation tests are really simple, because you set up your expectation first, and then you do something to trigger it, and then you do an expectation of that. So in these cases, we're doing some setup up here in the before, so that's unique per test, where we create a view controller, we pass it in a forgeries user defaults, and we set up all the settings. So this means that we can set all the individual settings. We can like clarify that what we expect to be true is true when different defaults are set up. It's again, I keep saying this, but like some of this stuff is like really nice, because it's an elegant way of having some small input and a concise output. And like, writing programs is complex, and being able to like test all these things to be exactly what you expect is like part of your job. So these are some of the tests, and you can just see like we're passing them on, and that's great. And it's like input, output tests. Great. They create an email settings. So the email settings then is then used in an AI email composer. Yep, great. AI email composer is something that you can create with a host view controller and an email settings. So it has no idea about the modern email artworks view controller, and no, there's no connection there at all. And it only knows about email settings. So again, this is nice, because the AI email composer tests are also really simple, because you have that separation of the AI email settings in between. Then like we test that the email settings is correct on one side, and then with an email settings we've tested on the other side. So what we can do is we can keep passing in different AI email settings, and we can keep seeing like, what is the subject when you have only one artwork? What is the subject when we have two artworks in the settings? And what is the subject when blah, 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 when you've customized the subject? Super nice, super clean. So again, like we've got describe blocks of when you've only passed in one artwork, we can create an artist and an artwork, and then we pass it through. It's it's like the before is really nice, and then you just set an it where it does a tiny little bit of work, and then you tell it to do the work, and then you just expect at the end. So again, this stuff is well tested because this is like really important stuff to us. It's like the core part of this application. So the code itself is relatively short, under 250 lines. And its general job is to create the MF mail compose view controller, set that up, and what it does is it's a simple function, but it's not a simple function, right? It's a complex function because of all the amount of things that it could change inside it because of all these different settings throughout the application. And we have a lot of ways of testing it because of the separation of like settings object to actual work done. Some of the stuff around the body is kind of interesting. So we generate we don't generate. We use Mustache here to do. So it's like email mustache. No. Support email template. No, email artwork template. There we go. So we use Mustache, which is a like HTML template library, where you pass it an email settings, and you pass it, and it will just sort of like iterate through the artworks and show all the additional images. And this has been a really nice abstraction in order to logically create some of the more tricky outputs that we have for generating the HTML. One of the great things about Mustache is that you can ask it to render specific views, specific model objects. Now, if I can remember, I think it's this one. I think it's the additional images. I think they were really hard to figure out, like really hard to find a way to make that like actually work. So I think what I ended up doing was install short image. One of these things conforms to a protocol from the Mustache, and then it's its job. And then install shots? No. Then it was its job to render itself, which I found super, super elegant. Maybe it's additions. Additions is really complicated. Right, there we go. So I'll just show you roughly before we start. There is maybe one of these has got an addition. There we go. So this one has multiple additions. You can see here, because it says it has multiple additions. When you click through, you can see these additions. These additions are like, you don't buy an artwork. Well, you could buy an artwork, but there is a full set of artworks. And so this is the full set. In this case, there's a version that is 18 by 24 inches, and there's a version that's 20 by 34 inches. Including that sort of stuff inside Mustache is extremely complicated. So one of the ways that they get around that is that you just pass in the object to Mustache, and it says like, how do you render itself? Well, these can actually start looking at the settings and like showing the internal data in a way that would be very difficult to do inside a more or less logicless templating language. Cool. Okay, so we have emailing, which works on the separation of a modern email artworks view controller. In the center is the email settings, and then there's the email composer, which then generates it and then presents it. Fab. Okay, so that's generally the flow that we've just talked about. Everything from going from the root view controller, clicking through into these grids, to then like clicking the mail, and then composing a mail. So this generates the email settings object that then is then passed to another thing, and that other thing that triggers this stuff. Fabulous. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to go into here then is I wanted to talk a little bit about like some of the testing patterns that we've got, because I keep bringing it up because it's kind of important to us. We have many reasons to want to test, but like finding ways to test testing's not necessarily fun, but testing is important. and so you don't want your tests to be a proper chore. So let's look at the tests. So if I just like close off the normal classes, you can get a sense of like how many tests we have, and that's not even opening all of the different bits. So best way to start is to look at the beginning. How does the app load? Well, when you load the main, it will choose depending on whether there is a XC test case in the run path. So is it running a test? It will either create an app test delegate or an app delegate. We've already gone through the app delegate, so let's look at the test delegate. Okay, so top comment, no op for tests. If you look at this, there is no functions. If you look in the implementation, there is no implementation. It is a complete no op. It does nothing. So I wrote a comment in while I was doing my first initial look through of like, what should I talk about? And was like, okay, so I know there's something else. And there's the app test setup. And the app test setup is different. It's not like an app delegate, but it is a SBT global before after each. So what is that? Well, this is something in Spectre, the testing framework that we use, that it allows you to set up a single function that gets called before every single test. So what we do is we set up the application on every single test. And I know what someone behind the scenes is probably doing. They're like, oh, Shakara, isn't that slow? And it's not. It's not slow at all. It's really good. And that's like something that I care about a lot, because like slow tests are just not fun at all. So here you see it setting up the NS user defaults each time. In this case, we use forgeries, which means that we have an API compatible version of NS user defaults, but it has different stuff. It makes it easier to introspect. You can go look at forgeries, the pod that we have, to like really dig into that. So we set up the router. Generally, this only sets up the kind of HTTP client that would be used for generating all of the NSURL requests. Yeah, NSURL requests and the JSON stuff, and JSON parsing. It sets up the theme. I didn't show it in here, but like this is the black theme. You can bring up settings, and you can go to background, white background. And then we can hide this, and ta-da, it's white. I know, shocking, right? It's pretty complicated stuff, but under the hood. But in case you really like want to understand how that works, we have this thing called AR theme, which uses UI appearance like throughout the application in order to handle theming, which works out really well, because every single view responds to a function called tint color did change. So we trigger a tint color did change all the way through the app, and anything that would need to change its color, so like these labels, it does for us ish. Yeah, because we have like a global for the current color for like foreground and background. So in theory, you could like have a bright green and purple one. Don't recommend it, but it's an option. But it's an option for developers. So we set up the theming. We say set up with white folio. No, it's going to be black. And we create an AR OHTTP no stubs assertion bot, which will look for every single. It'll look through every time. I'll bring up the code while I try to explain it. Every time every time a networking request happens, it looks through OHTTP networking requests collection of stubs. If it doesn't find it, then it will crash, and you get this lovely stack trace that tells you what test it crashed on, what matcher in case it was like inside like an expect. It then tells you the full URL. It gives you a recommendation for what you want to show inside, like, copy and pastable code, and then gives you a full stack trace of like the steps preceding the crash, which is great. These steps are even better because the stack trace is a filter stack trace where we say The only things you care about is artsy API stuff and get requests, so you know exactly where in the stack trace like the important parts are, and then we highlight those instead of just like showing you everything. Uh, this stuff is great. We use it in Eigen. We have a more complicated version in Eigen, but that's another story. And that works out pretty well. I'm pretty happy with that. So okay, that's like the app setup. So this is like it's like the app delegate, but it happens every single test. Oof. Okay. The other important aspects around testing for us are the AR test contexts. These are API. These are pretty simple APIs, which is you can say you want to test specifically on a device like iPhone 4, iPhone 5, iPhone 6, and iPad. So it wraps. It's a block API. We saw it earlier when I was showing you all the snapshots for the AR mail view control, AR modern Outworks email, whatever. And it allows you to wrap like some code inside a specific device. So this means that you don't have to run multiple test suites, or like have tests run on multiple devices, or have device independent snapshots. All of which are definitely options, but all of which I feel don't optimize towards developer happiness. So yeah, deal with it. Right, next one on our list is AR stubs core data. Right, look at that. Tiny amount of code. Whew, used everywhere. Within our app, we have a core data manager, which is like our global for accessing the main managed object contents on new ones, persistent score coordinators, managed object models, blah, blah, blah. It also kind of deals with like sync builds. It has its own separate managed object context that constantly is being updated in the background thread. And then every now and again it sends like notifications out saying maybe you should merge me, so you can sync in the background and still get incremental sync. And that works out pretty well. But the stub core data is like a really nice version. It just goes and gets all this data out of the core managed object core. It accesses the core data manager and pulls out a stubbed one. Oh no, it's not even it. It just we normally use this one. We access the core data manager. It's just built into the API. It's like it's in the app. It's the same thing as the normal one, but instead the persistent store coordinator is a where is it? It's like a memory store type. Here we go. So we generate a core data managed object model, which is like the current most up to date like database model. We then create a persistent store, which is built in memory. And then this memory one is the one that is then used throughout all the testing, and this one is significantly faster. It also is synchronous too, because you want synchronicity in your test, because you want to make sure they don't get flaky. So that works really nice. The core data manager, pretty much every view controller has to touch this somewhere. So like here's the first line, and I just clicked on a random one, edit album view controller, it generates its own context, and then we generate some objects inside these contexts. These are just like extensions that exist for that came from I think 2011. I think was the latest commit that I could find for this. I had to go and make a README for this to be like, here are the changes that I've made in order to conform with the original license for Magical Record / REST-Kit. And I was open sourcing it. I wrote about that. So that's nice stuff. The core data, passing around these core data contexts is really cheap and quick, and makes it really easy to test because you can set up the database before, you can run some like tests, and then see what it looks like. The next one I wanted to look at was AR Expector extensions. These are some macros that turn into like one of these two functions. Because right now we have effectively 4 separate states the app could be in visually. There's like iPad and iPhone, and then there's white and black. We have its snapshots for view controller with devices and color states, which basically says I want to create 4 snapshots with like a specific context. So this little bit of test here gets ran 4 times with like, here's the iPhone version in white, here's the iPad version, here's the iPad version in white. These make for like really nice tests. These make for really short tests. Let's see if I can find these ones. So this is the AR document preview view controller. So we go into tests, we look in reference images, yep. So that's AR document, and you see there's 4 of them. So that's what it looks like in the iPad. That looks like it's white. Looks like the iPhone. Looks like it's white. Great. It's nice and simple. These tests, you could argue they don't show too much, but they do show enough. They show that there's a difference between the iPad and the iPhone. They show the difference between the black and the white. Great. So that's like this pattern works out pretty nicely. It makes it easy to write tests that cover like a lot of the different states, and pretty happy with it. Finally, I wrote down to cover forgeries, but like you can just go and look it up if you'd like. It's hey socks, cookwords.org/pods/forgeries. It's just a collection of things for UI just to recognize this, and it's user defaults, which we've covered in here, and a file manager, which we don't use in this because it's really new, and view traits, which we don't use in this because it's also really, really new. They provide APIs that are pretty elegant for testing things where you can stop access to singletons. Really useful. So those are like the majority of the things that I wanted to cover with respect to like the key user flow within Folio. Because of things like these stubbed managed object context, it's very easy for us to provide like a full context for an object. Because this is built to work offline, and you don't have all these networking requests, like trying to say like, have I got give me all the artists. It just asks locally. So it's like a problem that not many apps have per se. But a lot of these things work easily because they're nicely separated into like model objects and like things that act on model objects. And so just in case you want to spend a little bit more time in here, one of the other interesting things is that all of these model objects, so if I go to the artwork, great, they have subclasses of underscore versions of themselves. So we use something called mode generator, which is really nice and great work. Whoever built that, I think it was Wolf Wrench. Not sure. But it lets you go from no, let's go look for what the model objects look like. Data artsy partner, the XC data model. So we have a relatively complex like data model structure for all of this. It's not too complex, it's totally understandable. I've seen some that are not. But it generates one of each of these. It generates them as an underscore version, and then you can just see all the actual ones. And it generates some useful structs and default settings for the objects. Whereas like then when you go to the document model, it actually represents all the logic that sits on top of it. So presentable file name. Not something that should be like directly associated with the model, but actually associated with the object itself. Complicated. And so that's been really good too. Been really happy with that. Other patterns, I think about that. I think like some of this stuff is just you should just have a dig around, I think, and have a play and see how it all works. So that is the overview of Energy. You can obviously download and clone and look at it at artsy.com/artsy-energy. Oof, starting to I got a cold, so I'm starting to really slow down. And it's a pretty big code base because it's old, but it also happens to be like pretty approachable if you've had a play around and are interested in seeing how bits work. Um, and otherwise, you can also look at our docs. We have a little doc section. It's pretty good. It covers a bunch of stuff. So thanks for listening. Drop me feedback. As this is a YouTube video, you could probably subscribe, wherever the button is, or not. And I'll probably be building another one of these soon, maybe tomorrow, in order to talk about how sync works, because sync is the other complicated part of this application, and it probably represents about 30% of the code. So trying to discuss that is a half an hour long task at least. So have a good one, everyone. Put this up on a blog, and hopefully I can get some feedback from the Artsy mobile team on the video, and then we'll put that in the text, maybe? No. All right. So, ciao, everyone.